Good morning. It's been a while. Trust you guys are waking up feeling refreshed and ready to begin a new day. Today, can you believe it? Today is Monday, January the 6th. I hope you guys had a great holiday. I really missed everybody. We had my sons and their spouses over for the holidays, and um, Christmas Eve was amazing. Um, I last time we spoke, I told you I was going to do this whole lobster bisque thing, and we had three services on Christmas Eve, and so at the end of the Christmas Eve services, I went into the church's kitchen and I cooked all those lobsters. I didn't leave until 2 o'clock in the morning, and it was a Christmas day, and because there are alarms on the building, and I'm never usually there that late. So I walked out of the kitchen and I set off the alarms. So as I was walking back and forth, getting stuff from the kitchen and putting it in my car, a police car comes over and puts this big spotlight on me. And I'm like, yo, you got me. I've been poaching lobsters. So it was pretty funny. But yeah, so we got had a full house. Church yesterday, great beginning again. We're just starting our whole new series again on Casket Empty, and I trust that if you're joining us and you don't have those materials, there is a Old Testament Bible study guide, a timeline that if you get nothing else, I would go to casketempty.com and pick up that timeline because it is an awesome tool that just lays out so much information in a very digestible fashion. So yeah, I'm really excited. We're going to also beginning this Thursday. We I do what we call a deep dive, and so we're gonna. This will be something that we will do, you know, uh, on Thursday nights, and so it's like a small group for those who would like to just go a little bit deeper as we are working our way through this next section. Now, you do realize that Casket Empty is an acronym, right? It stands for Creation, Abraham, Sinai, Kings, Exile, Temple, and then the New Testament is the empty part, and that's expectations, Messiah, Pentecost, teachings, and yet to come. Under those brackets, we're going to take a look at this redemptive theme that ties our entire Bible together. So you see, opens up with creation, right? God creating a world perfect with a desire for man and God to dwell together, created a perfect environment where there was harmony, and sin enters into the world, fractures all of those kinds of relationships, changes the very dynamic in which we are experiencing God, right? He strolled in the garden, and now there's this wall of separation, and yet God has been showing, continuously throughout our study, right, how he's always trying to bring people back into fellowship with himself. And so, as God does that, we came across these studies, right? These times where you have the flood, or you have the covenant that God then makes with Abraham, and that covenant was a long standing covenant. It was going to have an impact on the world at large, not just the nation of Israel. God would promise a descendant to Abraham that would bless the nations of the world. And coming at a time, right, when Abraham was just 100 years old. And then you have Isaac, his son, who gives him two grandchildren, Jacob and Esau. Jacob would then be the recipient of this covenant promise. And from Jacob's line would come 12 sons, and they would become the 12 tribes. Eventually, God would form them into a nation under Moses, giving them a law, giving this covenant that he makes with them. And they would fall into some tough times. They would be enslaved under Egyptian rule for over 400 years. and until the time that God raises up Moses, and through Moses, he delivers them out of their hands, right? And the consequence of that is God is about to fulfill the promise that he made to Abraham to give them a land, right? To give them a prosperity as well as posterity. And so all of these things are coming, but the people renege on the promise and they wind up wandering around in the desert for 40 years until God raises up Joshua. Joshua brings them into the promised land. They're in there. They begin to take over this land. They're beginning to settle in, and everything is going well through Joshua. And then you come to the book of Judges, and in the book of Judges, we find what? We find that every man is doing what is right in his own eyes. And it just goes from bad to worse. If you ever read through the book of Judges, it's really a tough read because you just see what man left to his own devices, it's going to accomplish. And so from there, we get the stories of Ruth, right? Because Ruth is in this period of time of the Judges, and we see that even during this period, God is still working this redemptive thread, because as God is working through his people, God then brings Boaz into the picture, becomes the father of Jesse. Jesse becomes the father of David. And so we could see how God is now beginning to move again, and how this thread is beginning to continue. And that's where we are now. So we are in week 10, right? So this is week 10, and it's called God's Anointed King. That's the chapter that we're looking at, and this is what's going to preoccupy our time this week. It's all about really how God's promise now is going to continue during this period of the kings. And during the period of the kings, its most prominent king is going to be David, and partly because of the promises that God is going to make in and through David. This becomes a huge part then of this story that I'd like to share a little bit with you today. And part of what I would like to begin with here is just giving you a little bit of some background, because on Sunday I talked a lot about David himself, and in particular that God made a covenant with David. So if you haven't listened to the sermon on Sunday, it might be something, if you want to go for a walk someday, you could just listen to it. It will give you a little bit more background, not just on David as a person, but my intent on Sunday was to demonstrate what God was doing by raising up David. See, because there's so much going on in this period of time that you could almost get lost in the midst of all the names and the places, and I think that's a level of frustration that a lot of people have when it comes to the scriptures, and especially in a period of time where culture is so different, the time is such a long time ago, and you could sit back and think to yourself, how is this relevant to me in this day in which I'm living? So one of the things that I hope to do in this week is just to frame a little bit more about what is going on in the nation of Israel at this time, walk us through some of the big pieces of books, the historical books of your Old Testament, like 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles. Let's just take those 6 books for a moment, right? At one time, all of those books were part of one whole collection. 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings, they all tell this ongoing story that begins during the time of the judges and will end with the nation of Israel going into exile. So it takes place over a period of about 500 years, more or less. It starts around 1050, and the exile will come at around 586 BC. So, just to frame that in your head, you're just coming out of this period of Judges where everyone is doing what is right in his own eyes. There's chaos in the land. People are really no longer, heeding God's covenant the way he had called them to, and so the consequence of that is that it's just not faring well for the nation of Israel during this period. So um, First and Second Samuel and First and Second Kings, they are telling you this entire story. So you can read through those books, and they give you the history of what is taking place in Israel during this time period of the kings. And First and Second Chronicles is kind of like the Reader's Digest version of those four historical books. First and Second Chronicles, it highlights, because the author has a different purpose, but the author in First and Second Chronicles is just beginning to give you some highlighted pictures of what has been going on through this period of history, and then once in a while goes a little bit deeper to give you some further insight in what was taking place during that particular period. So for our discussions, I'm going to begin today in this week 10 with the concentration on David. Next week we're going to look at Solomon, and then we're going to see that this is a period that is known as the United Monarchy, right? This is all of Israel under one head. But after Solomon, we know that the kingdom is going to be divided. There's going to be a rift that's going to take place within the nation of Israel. It's going to separate them from a northern kingdom and a southern kingdom, and that's why if you have your timeline in front of you, you can see how that breaks out, and all the various kings. The northern kingdom will never have a faithful king. They are not the tribes where the promise is coming. The promise is going to come through the tribe of Judah, and the tribe of Judah is in the southern kingdom. And that's why you'll see, if you look at your timelines, there is a difference between a blue crown and a red crown. And that red crown is to give you an indication of where this promise that God has made to Abraham, and now he's going to be making to David, where all of those promises they come to bear. So let's just take a step back today, and as we're getting caught up again in this whole environment of this particular study of Casket Empty, first thing we're looking at this time of the kings, this period of the kings. But how does that start? Well, when you go back to your Bibles in First Samuel, it starts off with this story of a woman named Hannah, and the story kind of reminds you again of that same dynamic that was taking place between Jacob and his wives Leah and his other wife Rachel. Only in this story, what we are finding taking place here is in First Samuel chapter 2. Elkanah is the name of the husband, and he has two wives, and those two wives, one is called Peninnah, and the other is called Hannah. They are living in the region, the land that is been divided and given to Bethlehem, to Benjamin, and it's a town called Bethlehem. And so, in this story, you realize that Peninnah had children, but Hannah, she didn't. And the story goes on that year after year, Elkanah, being a demonstrating his allegiance to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, would often go up to those prescribed times of worship. You know, you remember going back into the covenants that God made with Moses, how he was very clear on how they were going to worship him, the leadership that would be involved in leading that worship, that sacred space that God erected, because God had made his dwelling among men now, and God is holy, and so there was protocols that were needed, and God was making all of this clear in the systems of sacrifices. Remember, we looked at some of those as we went through the books of Exodus and Leviticus. They were the burnt offerings, right? The grain offerings, the peace offerings, the guilt offering, the sin offering. All of these were ways in which the nation of Israel would engage. And they would be reminded of two things: one, of God's holiness, but also of their own sinfulness that needed to be atoned for. And part of that atonement was in the offering up of those sacrifices. It provided meat for feasts that would be taking place then, and it was also a way to give back to the priests who were laboring in this whole worship experience. So it's during this period of time, and right now that the Ark of the Covenant is in a place called Shiloh. It will soon be moved, as you will read in 1 Samuel, from Shiloh to Jerusalem, and it's in Jerusalem that the temple will be built. So I know I'm giving you a lot of information today, but this is information that we're going to go over a couple of times, and you begin to piece all of this together. So let me rewind this one more time so I don't lose anybody. But we're leaving the period of the Judges, which is the end of this Sinai, period. And now we're about to enter into the period of Kings. And so as we're moving from Judges to Kings, we have this story now that is setting up something that is telling us about the spiritual condition that we're going to discover here in Israel. And it leads us then to this story of Hophni, right? And Phinehas, two sons of Eli, who were priests before the Lord. So you have these new names that are being introduced to this picture, and all of which is because at the end of this story, we're going to come to the birth of Samuel. And Samuel is going to play an integral part in the unfolding of what takes place during this period. That's why this story is so important. It sets up a context of what is taking place within the nation of Israel at this point. Hannah, it says that she doesn't have children, and she prays that God would open up her womb. That she was loved by her husband Elkanah. There is a passage here. If you just keep First Samuel open as we have our discussion today, one of the things you notice, it says here that whenever Elkanah would go to sacrifice, remember those were those 3 feast days that God commanded the Israelites to participate in. Remember, Feast of Passover, right? The Feast of Tabernacles, Feast of Booths, right? And Feast of Pentecost. Like all of these were mandatory, and they came at different parts of the year. It was a way, really, of keeping the nation together and reminding them again of the spiritual purpose for which God raised them. So as Elkanah is being obedient to God's prescription here of how to worship. Remember, I told you part of those sacrifices, the offering up of these animals, the meat would then be taken, and that would be part of the feasts that the people would celebrate. So they would offer up the Passover lamb, and that lamb, then part of it would go to the priests for their portion, and then part of that meat would come back with the worshiper, and that would be used for a a festive time, for a week-long celebration, always reminding them of what God had done. And it was a these were special times in Israel's history. So it was just during one of these times. But notice what it said here in verse 5. It says, while Elkanah went to sacrifice, he would give portions of the meat to his wife. But in verse 5, he says he gave double portion to Hannah because he loved her. And the Lord had closed her womb. So isn't that such an interesting kind of way in which so many of these Old Testament stories come to be? You have, Abraham and Sarah, childless. You have Isaac when he gets married. Rebecca, she's, it's over 20 years before she bears him a son. They got married when he was 40, and he was 60 years old when the twins were born. And all that time, she's praying that God would give her a child. And then we know the story with Jacob and Rachel. She didn't have children until much later. Then she had Joseph and Benjamin. But here again, it seems like these are stories that kind of set pivotal moments in Israel's history, recognizing that the descendants that are going to come are all of God's choosing. I don't know if in your families, any of you, maybe some of you women that are watching, you've had some fertility issues. I know we've had a number in our families, and we're thankful for medications that and procedures that help to stimulate this whole fertility process. But yeah, in these days, they're praying, they're asking God to do something that they cannot do for themselves. So the fact that children are being born, and then how God chooses in certain lives to begin to fulfill these promises that he's making. Remember, he made this promise to Abraham that from his descendants would come one that would bless the nations. People are looking for this person. And so now we begin to see how these sons of Abraham now are being identified. And one of these here now you're going to see is God is going to use this child that he's going to give to to Elkanah and Hannah. Hannah goes up to pray. When she's praying, she catches the attention of Eli the priest. Interesting kind of story there. She is pouring out her heart to God, and she's praying. And in verse 12 of 1 Samuel, it says, as she kept on praying to the Lord, Eli the priest, he observes her mouth, and Hannah was praying in her heart, and her lips were moving, but her voice was not heard. Eli thought she was drunk, and he said to her, how long will you keep on getting drunk? Get rid of your wine. I mean, that was kind of judgmental, right? He didn't realize the pain that this lady was going through, and as she is in deep prayer, her mouth is moving, but she's having this internal conversation with God, and Eli totally misunderstands, and then she turns around and she says to him, not so, my Lord. I am a woman who is deeply troubled. I have not been drinking wine or beer. I was pouring out my soul to the Lord. Do not take your servant for a wicked woman. I've been praying here out of my great anguish and grief. Yeah, because she doesn't have a child. And she's making a covenant with God that if he gave her a child, if God was to find favor with her, she would dedicate that child to the service of God. So Eli says to her, "Go in peace, and may the God of Israel grant you what you have asked of him." And sure enough, Hannah conceives, and she gives birth to a son, and she names him Samuel. And the word Samuel is it comes from a Hebrew word that means heard, heard of God, because God heard her. Samuel is proof positive that her womb has now been opened. She has this son. Samuel is going to play this integral part now, even in Eli's life. He's going to have a long, a long run, and be very influential in the direction in which Israel is going. And so I having set this story now of how we're getting into this next phase of kings, it's going to begin now with God raising up Samuel, who is a prophet, and he is going to be used by God to begin this whole new period in the life of Israel. Samuel is going to be about two things, and I'll close with this morning. Samuel is going to be underscoring the lack of leadership that you're finding, good, righteous leadership in Israel. And the other one is the steps that God is making to ensure that his presence is always with Israel. So you have this idea of leadership, and you have God's presence among them, and how all of that now begins to work together to accomplish the will and purposes for which God, has promised to Abraham, promised to Moses, and now you'll soon see, right? God is promising that to King David as well, in a covenant that God's going to make with David. But before we get there, I just want to give a little bit of this backstory that will make it that much more interesting. So you can see how the birth of Samuel is a whole God thing, and now God is going to use this child, in their future. Well, thanks so much for joining me. I really did miss you guys. I'm glad that we're, back into this rhythm and routine. I pray that you are experiencing God's blessings. This is going to be a great, great study, and I just know it's going to encourage you to be that much more faithful in this 2025. So thanks again for joining me on this January 6th, 2025. See what the Lord will bring. But always remember, right? As you seize this day, remember that God is good all the time. God bless you, my friends. Lord willing, we'll spend more time again tomorrow. God bless.